And bringing us back into session, we'll turn now to our historical presentation scheduled for today. President Eisenhower's Civil Rights Legacy and the Creation of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. On September 9th, 1957, one day short of exactly 60 years ago, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1957, establishing the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. This legislation was the first major civil rights legislation since the Reconstruction era, creating both this commission and the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. The law was a testament to the power of bipartisan compromise and survived the longest filibuster in Senate history. Though the legislation was hotly contested, it reflects an origin point for today's national consensus, as expressed in federal legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and other critical legislation, that there are certain civil rights that must be protected and that the federal government has a powerful and necessary role in ensuring those protections. We are so grateful to have with us today two individuals who will bring a wealth of knowledge about President Eisenhower and his work on civil rights. Our first speaker, Dawn Hammatt, is with us here in person. Ms. Hammett was named Director of the Dwight D. Eisenhower Library, Museum, and Boyhood Home in May 2017. Ms. Hammett has served in museums across the Southeast for her entire career. In South Carolina, she served as managing director for a local history museum and on the governing board for the South Carolina Archival Association. In New Orleans, she was the director of curatorial services for the Louisiana State Museum, a statewide museum system that maintains 9 museums. She has also been active in the Southeastern Museums Conference and currently serves as the vice president. Ms. Hammett holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Louisiana State University, a Master of Liberal Studies from the University of Oklahoma, and is currently enrolled in a professional certificate program in nonprofit administration at the University of Montana. Our second speaker, Dr. David Nichols, joins us by phone. Dr. Nichols is a presidential historian and a leading authority on the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dr. Nichols' book on President Eisenhower and civil rights, titled A Matter of Justice, Eisenhower and the Beginning of the Civil Rights Revolution, was published in 2007. His publisher, Simon & Schuster, describes it as the definitive book on Eisenhower's civil rights policies. He also published a book on the Suez Canal crisis entitled Eisenhower 1956, The President's Year of Crisis, Suez and the Brink of War. And his newest book, Eisenhower and McCarthy, Dwight Eisenhower's Secret Campaign Against Joseph McCarthy, documents for the first time how Eisenhower destroyed Senator McCarthy's political influence. A native of Kansas, Dr. Nichols has his PhD in history from the College of William and Mary. Dr. Nichols is the former academic dean at Southwestern College in Winfield, Kansas. Ms. Hammett, we will hear from you first. Thank you.
Good morning, commissioners, special guests, ladies and gentlemen. What a delight it is to be here with you on this beautiful September day. We are here to observe and commemorate the creation of the United States Commission on Civil Rights, which was established under the Eisenhower presidency. As the director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library, Museum, and Boyhood Home in Abilene, Kansas, I was invited to share a few thoughts with you on Eisenhower and his formative years. I am rather new to this position, having only begun in early June, and I still find myself learning about this great man. So I am truly honored to be here today, representing the National Archives and Records Administration and the Eisenhower Presidential Library. I do firmly believe that his childhood in Kansas and early career in the Army supported his belief in equality for all. Please let me share just a few of the highlights of what I have learned. The Eisenhower family belonged to a religious group known as the River Brethren. This religious movement was primarily composed of German immigrants in Pennsylvania, who were generally farmers, hard workers, and pacifists. The Eisenhower family moved from Pennsylvania to the Kansas Plains in 1878 when Ike's father, David, was merely 15 years old. Ike's mother, Ida Stover, was of German-Swiss Protestant heritage and was born in Virginia. Due to her mother's death, Ida lived with other family members. They believed that girls should study the Bible rather than go to school. When she was not allowed to enroll in high school, she ran away. She successfully graduated high school at the age of 19 and moved to Kansas with two of her brothers. She was even a teacher for 2 years prior to enrolling in Wayne University in Kansas, where she met and married fellow student David in 1885. David received money and land from his father when he and Ida married, but David was not interested in farming. He sold the land and bought a dry goods store in partnership with a man named Milton Good. The store is located about 25 miles south of Abilene in Hope, Kansas. The store prospered until a drought and grasshopper invasion destroyed crops, as well as the fortunes of the local farmers. Many of these former farmers shopped in David's store on credit, and they could no longer pay their bill. The result, of course, was the closing of the store, and David moved his small family to Denison, Texas in 1889 to work for the railroad. There he worked as an engine wiper on the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad. The family's third son, David Dwight Eisenhower, now known to the world as Ike, was born in Denison in 1890. He's the only one of the 7 Eisenhower boys to be born outside of Kansas. But their extended family back in Kansas encouraged the young family to return home, so David moved his family to Abilene in 1892. No matter where they lived, the family participated in religious services by holding Bible classes and hymn singing at the home. We know that Bible teachings were very important to the family, and this followed Ike throughout his life. The family's second home in Abilene, where they moved in 1898, is the cornerstone of our campus. It's the only presidential home owned by the National Archives. In this very modest structure, Ike lived with his immediate family, as well as his grandfather, Jacob. The family Bible is on exhibition in the home, is prominently displayed, and the wear is quite visible. David worked at a local creamery as a refrigeration engineer. He received his certification through a correspondence course, which is like the 19th century version of an online school. He earned $10 per week and averaged 80 hours working each week. Ida was in charge of all of the day-to-day activities of the household. She taught all her sons to cook and clean and take care of themselves. I'm sure you can imagine how much help she needed as she ran a family of 6 boys. The boys tended the animals and helped with planting and harvesting and putting up the produce from the family's half-acre garden, and that was their main source of food. Those familiar with the Eisenhower family know that they lived on the wrong side of the tracks. They were not considered affluent at all. And Ike recalled that the boys were not aware that they were poor, and wrote that the boys lived a wonderful life of hunting, fishing, helping with family chores, and playing sports. But I can imagine, as any parent can, that Ida was protective of her boys. She shielded them from any snide remarks about their hand-me-downs or of their lack. She made sure they understood to respect other people, respect a hard day's work, and an honest living. She taught them fairness, humility, and earnestness. Abilene, during this time, was not particularly diverse, but one story has been handed down that Ike, while playing football for Abilene High School, was initially the only team member willing to play directly against an African-American student. In a handwritten note, now located in the Army Chief of Staff files, which is in Nara Holding, Ike wrote, "I played center that day for the only time in my life. I shook hands with the chap before and after the game. The rest of the team was a bit ashamed." Ike's willingness to step up and do the right thing by shaking hands and then agreeing to play opposite the African-American student demonstrated his philosophy of equality and his early leadership skills. Without his words, his forthright actions shamed fellow teammates into joining him in the game. There are no records that discuss his reasons, but I believe that Ida taught him to be a good man, to be kind to others, to do what is right for your team, and to do what is right for each other. I can imagine that the Bible stories shared as family and hymns sung together played a role in how Ike decided to treat this young man. Ike's other childhood interactions with non-whites were also on the athletic field. He joined the local Abilene town baseball team and played against the Cherokee Indians, which was a noted team out of Nebraska, and against an all-African-American team. Eisenhower also fought a boxing match against a local African-American fighter named Dirk Tyler one summer during a break from West Point. These early experiences, along with his personal responsibility and respect for others instilled by his parents, served as the foundation for his actions in adulthood. Ike spent his military career in a segregated army, but he still managed to work with people of color in a variety of different assignments. He was briefly the executive officer of the 24th Infantry Regiment at Fort Benning in 1926. This is one of the historic Buffalo Soldier units, but even this modest assignment was more than most officers ever experienced. Eisenhower also had the advantage over his fellow officers, first with service in Panama in the early 1920s, and later in the Philippines from 1934 to 1939, where he worked closely with his hosts to build an army and an air force. His social activities in the Philippines included bridge games with the Commonwealth's president, Manuel Quezon. Eisenhower, in other words, was no stranger to diverse cultures and people. But later, some historians claim that Ike never socialized with non-whites, a statement which is easily refuted by evidence in our archival holdings. The Army's official segregation policies, despite the Army's official segregation policies, Eisenhower developed a close friendship with his Army valet, Sergeant John Money. Money joined Ike's staff in 1942 and remained with the general until Ike's death in 1969. Money's wife, Dolores, also worked for the Eisenhowers. The Moneys were so close to Ike, Money, their son John, and his children that they considered the Moneys family. They still do. As a matter of fact, just last night, one of the family members told me 2 stories about the Moneys, how Dolores always remembered that Ike would take his hat off for her. And that was something that was very impressive to her, that it meant a lot to her that Ike took his hat off to her every time he saw her. And she reminded me that John Money is the only African-American pallbearer at a presidential funeral ever. Eisenhower, as David Nichols will tell you, finished the integration of the military ordered by President Truman. In his final speech before the presidential election in 1952, Ike issued a 10-point statement summarizing the pledges he made during the campaign and promised to fulfill them, including serving all the people, regardless of color, and promoting equality of opportunity. When he entered office in 1953, Ike was determined to do everything he could in his role as president to remove social barriers for all Americans. Here's what he did, either by executive order, executive decision, or enabling legislation. He desegregated Washington, D.C. and its schools. He banned discrimination in firms receiving federal contracts. As I noted a moment ago, he completed the desegregation of the armed forces, and this included base housing and dependent schools. He appointed desegregationist federal judges. He signed the first 2 civil rights bills since Reconstruction. These bills also served as the basis for the 1965 Voting Rights Bill, according to Bill Moyers of the Johnson administration. Those bills also established the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and formalized his ad hoc President's Committee on Civil Rights with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He sent federal troops to Little Rock to enforce a federal court order to integrate schools. He appointed the first African-American to executive position in the White House, E. Frederick Morrow. He had the first African-American secretary, Lois Lippman, and welcomed the first African-American to a cabinet meeting, J. Ernest Wilkins, as the Assistant Secretary of Labor. I would note that any president prior to Ike could have done any number of these things by executive order or by personal decision, and they didn't. Yet Eisenhower didn't get the credit he deserved until records released by the Eisenhower Presidential Library enabled scholars like David Nichols to put the whole story together. Prior to the books of Mr. Nichols and other historians correcting the record, an image of Ike as a do-nothing president on civil rights prevailed among scholars. I think part of the problem can be traced to Ike's words, or lack thereof, and this particular part of the problem can be traced to his core beliefs in both leadership and the role of the chief executive. Ike's creed is succinctly expressed in his motto. We all know Harry Truman's, the buck stops here, right? But do we remember Ike's? It's not well known, but here it is. Suavita in moto, fortita in re, or in English, gentle in manner, strong in deed. I think this is reminiscent of his boyhood hero, Theodore Roosevelt's speak softly and carry a big stick. The idea is that your actions are more important than your words. Ike didn't have to say that he was honest or humble, or that he believed in equality. His actions spoke volumes. And while Ike's actions on civil rights were strong and enforced by the big stick of the federal government and the 101st Airborne Division, his rhetoric was quiet yet firm. He did not believe it was his place to either praise or condemn the decision of the Supreme Court. Rather, he firmly believed in the constitutional separation of powers and that the executive branch, through its actions, must uphold the law. In summary, Ike learned from a young age that right was right and wrong was wrong, and that a higher power created all men equal. He carried these beliefs to the athletic field, to the Army, and to the Oval Office, where he advanced the cause of civil rights to the furthest in more than a generation. All of this laid the groundwork for the legislative achievements of his successors and commenced the important work of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it. Next, we'll turn to Dr. Nichols.
Yes, I'm on it.
Terrific, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, Dawn. Hi, Dawn. Thank you for a great job. Commission members and staff, I regret that I cannot be with you there today, but I'm honored to be with you. And as an American citizen, I take great pride in the work of the Commission on Civil Rights. Your existence is indeed a major legacy of President Eisenhower's Civil Rights Program. For decades, Dwight Eisenhower's record was ignored and deprecated by my profession. In 1962, a survey of historians rated Ike 28th out of 34 presidents. Recently, a survey of 193 historians ranked Eisenhower 5th, only behind Lincoln, Washington, and the two Roosevelts. However, a decade after the publication of my book on civil rights, numerous scholars and journalists still resist the documented facts. So Dawn has given you an overview of some of those, and I will sound a little bit repetitious, but dig those holes just a little deeper if possible. And then we'll come back to look at the legislation, particularly, and how it's passed to create the Civil Rights Commission. But just to reemphasize what Eisenhower did in civil rights, as Dawn said, he desegregated the District of Columbia, something President Truman had not done. When Eisenhower took office, an African American visitor to downtown Washington could not buy a meal, attended a movie, rent a room in a first-class hotel, or with rare exceptions, enjoy unsegregated parks, playgrounds, swimming pools, or bowling alleys. Eisenhower personally lobbied motion picture moguls to desegregate the movie theaters. The Eisenhowers desegregated White House events and refused to attend segregated activities in the city. By the end of 1954 in Washington, D.C., segregation was largely a thing of the past. Again, as Dawn mentioned, Eisenhower completed the desegregation of the armed forces. And completed is the word. President Truman issued an executive order in 1948, but in 1953, most American combat units were still segregated. By October 30th, 1954, not a single segregated combat unit remained. During his first 2 years in office, Eisenhower also desegregated the Veterans Administration, military bases in the South, federally controlled schools for military dependents, and other military agencies. And again, as Dawn noted, Eisenhower appointed the first African-American executive in the White House, E. Frederick Morrow. And he created committees on government contracts, both to eliminate discrimination in contracting and in discrimination in hiring. And of course, our point here today is that Eisenhower proposed, fought for, and signed the Civil Rights the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the first such legislation in 82 years. In fairness, President Truman had proposed legislation that was unsuccessful due to the stranglehold Democratic Southern segregationists had on the Senate. Eisenhower's proposal included provision for the creation of a bipartisan Civil Rights Commission. That's you folks. We'll come back to that legislation, but let me just finish the main points about Eisenhower's record. In 1953, Eisenhower nominated Earl Warren, the governor of California, as Chief Justice of the United States. The president announced that nomination on September 30th, 1953, and with Congress out of town, made a recess appointment. Warren assumed his seat immediately and began to work on the Brown school desegregation case. Warren was not confirmed by the Senate until March 1, 1954. But on May 17, 1954, Warren announced the unanimous Supreme Court decision declaring segregated schools unconstitutional and striking down the court's 1896 separate but equal ruling. A year later, in Brown 2, the Eisenhower administration's Justice Department proposed that school districts be required to submit desegregation plans within 90 days, and Eisenhower personally edited that brief. However, the Supreme Court chose a less stringent requirement, ordering desegregation, quote, with all deliberate speed. Third Marshal said that meant slow. When the Brown ruling was announced, Eisenhower immediately ordered the commissioners of the District of Columbia to develop a desegregation plan for the district's schools. He later appointed 4 additional justices to the Supreme Court, all strong supporters of Brown and desegregation. And Dawn, I think, noted also that Eisenhower refused to appoint known segregationists to the lower federal courts. His appointees to the 4th and 5th Circuits in the South were courageous defenders of Brown and desegregation. But Ike's most dramatic civil rights action was his decision to send the 101st Airborne into Little Rock, Arkansas on September 24, 1957. Mob violence erupted when 9 African-American students attempted to desegregate Central High School in response to a court order by an Eisenhower appointee, Ronald Davies. Governor Orville Faubus deployed the Arkansas National Guard to prevent desegregation. Faubus later broke an agreement with Eisenhower to order the Guard to protect the students desegregating the school, instead withdrawing the troops and allowing new violence against the students. Then Eisenhower acted, sending in the 101st. Now, get back to what you're really waiting for is the 1957 Civil Rights Act. It's a complicated task to explain the workings of Congress in a few minutes, but I'll try. On January 10th, 1957, in his State of the Union address, President Eisenhower proclaimed his goal of, quote, moving closer to the goal of fair and equal treatment of citizens without regard to race or color. His 4-part proposal included, for one, a bipartisan Civil Rights Commission, a Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department, authority for the Attorney General to seek federal court orders in civil rights cases, and finally, protection of voting rights. That third part, the new authority for the Attorney General, became the great bone of contention in getting the legislation passed. Eisenhower's challenge was to break the alliance of segregationist Southern Democrats with conservative Republicans that had blocked Truman's legislation. And he did it, creating a powerful civil rights coalition. Democratic Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson cooperated in some regards, agreeing to conduct around-the-clock sessions to exhaust the filibustering Southerners and make sure that the legislation got to the floor by bypassing Senator James Eastland's Judiciary Committee, where civil rights legislation had always gone to die. The segregationists charged that Part 3, giving the authority to the Attorney General to seek court orders for desegregation, would, 1, empower the president to use troops in the South to enforce desegregation, and 2, lead to the prosecution of defendants resisting court orders before a judge, thereby depriving the defendants of a trial by jury. Excuse me. These civil suits, they argued, would become criminal prosecutions if the defendant failed to comply. The segregationists, with Lyndon Johnson's support, relentlessly pushed these 2 strategies to take the teeth out of the legislation. Ike's civil rights legislation easily passed the House of Representatives. Johnson was complicit in devising a sneaky strategy to bypass the Judiciary Committee. Vice President Nixon read the House bill title in a low voice. A Southern senator raised a point of order, but Nixon overruled him. Then the entire Senate voted to support the Vice President's ruling, taking the bill out of the Judiciary Committee and making it official legislation for the entire Senate. That set the stage for the big fight in July and August 1957. On July 2nd, 1957, the prestigious Senator Richard Russell of Georgia rose on the Senate floor to attack Part 3 of the Civil Rights Bill. That section, Russell proclaimed, would, quote, destroy the system of separation of the races in the southern states at the point of a bayonet, unquote. Russell doubted that the, quote, the full implications of the bill have ever been fully explained to President Eisenhower. Russell's attack put Ike under siege. He worried to the Attorney General that the language of the bill might, quote, scare people to death. Eisenhower met with Russell and reluctantly agreed to consider amendments to the bill. On July 16th, the senators voted 71 to 18 to make the Civil Rights Bill the pending business of the Senate. Eisenhower publicly supported all 4 parts of the bill, but hinted at compromise. At a news conference, Eisenhower proclaimed that he could not, quote, imagine any set of circumstances that would ever induce me to send federal troops to enforce the orders of the federal court. In fact, Ike and Attorney General Brownell had introduced legislation to provide an alternative to military action. Moreover, as you know, 2 months later, Eisenhower sent troops into Little Rock. But Ike could not hold out against the agitation stirred up by Senator Russell. Lyndon Johnson met with the president and told him bluntly that he had the votes to kill the bill altogether if Part 3 stayed in it. Reluctantly, Eisenhower agreed to drop the provision. The senators now redoubled their effort to weaken Part 4, which would allow the Attorney General to sue in civil court to enforce voting rights. They argued that such actions would be criminal prosecutions in disguise and should be tried by a jury. And in the South in 1957, that meant an all-white jury. And yes, LBJ supported that argument. August 1st, the Senate voted 51 to 43 to require a jury trial for the prosecution of criminal contempt for voting rights violations. Eisenhower's aides said he was, quote, angrier than ever before during his presidency. One senator said Ike was damned unhappy. Eisenhower hinted he might veto the bill, but even liberal Democrats caved in and supported the weakened bill. Eisenhower scorned them. Quote, why have liberals put so much heat on to get a bill after abandoning all of their principles? Unquote. Then the Eisenhower forces made a bold gamble. They threatened to revive the hated Part 3 of the bill if the jury trial provision stayed in it. After a big fight on August 16th, the administration proposed that in voting rights cases, a federal judge could act without a jury as long as the penalty did not exceed $300 or 90 days in jail. Lyndon Johnson, still wanting a cosmetic bill to promote his presidential aspirations, finally called Ike and proposed a ceiling of $300 and 45 days in jail. Ike accepted that compromise. And on August 29th, the Senate passed the final version of the Civil Rights Bill 60 to 15. Those 60 votes included 37 Republicans and 23 Democrats, and some scholars still haven't figured out that Lyndon Johnson could muster only 23 Democratic votes out of 49 for this weakened bill. It's the Eisenhower coalition that had carried the day. Some advocates, especially African-American leaders, urged Ike to veto the bill. However, even Martin Luther King Jr. concluded, quote, that the present bill is better than no bill at all. Well, the legacy. However weakened the bill was, the provisions for a Civil Rights Commission and a Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department survived, and as you know so well, still exists, making an impact for 6 decades. The new commission at that time had 2 mandates. One, to investigate any deprivation of voting rights and to study the laws and policies of the federal government to ensure equal protection of the laws. Southerners dragged out the appointment process, especially for appointees perceived as anti-segregation. The appointees were finally confirmed on March 5th, 1958. Since the 1957 Act, the commission has been reauthorized and reconfigured by legislation in 1983, 1991, and 1994. I might add that all this since legislation is not what I'm expert on, so I don't mind if you catch me in an error. The Commission published its first report in September 1959, recommending the federal registrars assist African American voting registration. It also reported on public school desegregation in the South and the need for low-cost housing throughout the nation. The commission assessed voting in Montgomery, Alabama, resulted in fierce resistance from Governor George Wallace. It held hearings on the implementation of the Brown Supreme Court decision in Nashville, Tennessee, and housing discrimination in Atlanta, Chicago, and New York. Most important, the Commission's findings provided a foundation for the Civil Rights Acts of 1960, 1964, 1965, and housing discrimination in 1968. In 1981, I understand that President Reagan appointed a conservative African-American chairman, Clarence Pendleton, an opponent of affirmative action. And in 1983, Reagan attempted to fire 3 members of the commission, but the law stated that a president could fire a commissioner only for, quote, misbehavior in office, unquote. A Senate compromise bill resulted in the current commission makeup of 8, half appointed by the president and half by the Congress, with 6-year terms that do not expire with the inauguration of a new president. And thank goodness for that. I understand that the commission recently voted to investigate federal civil rights enforcement under President Trump, expressing grave concerns over the administration's proposal to cut spending and staffing on civil rights efforts in multiple agencies and cutting out many positions in the Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department, the other enduring provision from Eisenhower's 1957 Civil Rights Act. With that, I will stop. Like with our soldiers, we should thank you, the Commission, the Civil Rights Commission members, for your service to the country. And if this brief presentation about ICE and civil rights confuses you, I can only say the book is a lot better than the speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nichols, and thank you very much, Ms. Hammond. I enjoy your presentations, and I invite my fellow commissioners to ask questions if they have any. Commissioner Sutton?
I really want to thank both of the speakers. It was very eye-opening to hear the background of where President Eisenhower, who is not talked about that often, and has an incredible record. I am curious because he was so forward-thinking on the issue of race, and yet under his administration, he signed an executive order that officially added sexual perversion as a ground for investigation and dismissal under the federal loyalty program, and basically allowed the denial or revocation of security clearance for people who were LGBT. So I'm wondering if you have any background history on that squares that with how forward-thinking he was on the issue of race.
Dawn, did you want to answer that, or shall I?
You can take it, David.
Okay, those orders are explored in my new book on Eisenhower and Joe McCarthy. And this is in the midst of the big Red Scare. And I don't excuse Eisenhower for that he was not progressive on that matter. The 1950s was a tremendously homophobic period. And so just the rumor that someone was gay, let alone the fact, could cost them their federal job, including under the Eisenhower administration. So I do not pretend that they were progressive about that. They were more progressive in some respects than the Truman administration, but there had not been any kind of awakening in that, and Eisenhower was just frankly not that progressive on it. He considered, you will find, it explained quite a bit in my new book, he considered the employment a privilege, not a right. And they were worried, and this is where the weeds really gets mixed with the flowers, is that they really worried that gay folks could be blackmailed by the communists. And in the midst of that communist Red Scare, a lot of people believed that. But that does not excuse it, and certainly doesn't excuse it for me, but they were not ready to move as progressively on that as they were on African American civil rights.
Commissioner Montague, you have the floor.
Yes, I have a separate question. So my father actually served in a segregated unit during World War II, the all Japanese American 442nd Regimental Combat Team. So I'm wondering where Eisenhower, what caused his interest in trying to continue the desegregation of the Army, and whether he ever came across, had any comment on the 442nd.
I do not, forgive me, Dawn, would you let me know? I tend to jump in on these things. I do not know of any comment about that particular troop contingent at all, but it is outlined in my book how Eisenhower campaigned to at least allow black regiments to be integrated with white regiments in the war, and he was turned down consistently by the Department of War. He could not carry it out. He did behind the scenes. He didn't make any public push for it. We did attempt to go farther than the government had gone. Having said that, I won't claim too much for that. I was in many ways a man of his time, but I think the important thing to remember is that Truman always gets credit in the textbooks for desegregating the armed forces, but Ike did most of it, and he was campaigning to do that even before he became president.
Thank you. I think the Vice Chair, you have questions?
Yes, thank you very much. Ms. Hammett and Dr. Nichols, this has absolutely been fascinating. I am a beneficiary of the schools that were operated for military-dependent children that I have now learned were desegregated by President Eisenhower. I grew up thinking that not only was he not a leader in civil rights, but all he did was play golf. I mean, I can remember that being said, in my hearing coming up. I began kindergarten in 1959 in Wiesbaden, Germany, in the dependent schools. And for one with my date of birth, it's fairly uncommon for one never to have attended segregated schools, but I owe it to the efforts that I now understand President Eisenhower was directly responsible for. And so...
But forgive me for interrupting, but
yes,
bless you for raising that issue, because Eisenhower desegregated those schools for military dependents before the Brown decision, before the Supreme Court decision.
I was noting...
It really is a very important thing.
I was noting that because I think Brown was May of 54, and I believe you said that 53 was, or 40, anyway, 53 was when he did this. So absolutely ahead of his time. So I thank you for the information, and I hope all of that word gets out. Let me ask you, now, Ms. Hammond, you said that President Eisenhower didn't see his role as one to speak out or take positions on court's opinions, yet Dr. Nichols, you indicate that President Eisenhower strongly supported the Supreme Court in Cooper v. Aaron. Will you say a bit more about how, in fact, he supported that opinion?
Are you asking me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, again, that's all you read my book, haven't you?
No, but I'll be going out to get it as quickly as I can.
Oh, well, he does, I don't have the quote in front of me, but actually people point at it that missed that he spoke out pretty strongly in Cooper v. Aaron, and this was having to do with Arkansas again. And so, but I wouldn't oversell that point. Eisenhower, it's true with Joe McCarthy too in my new book. I just wasn't a bully pulpit guy. And we modern people think if the president doesn't lead by using the bully pulpit, they're just not leading. That's not necessarily true. Lots of things are done by presidents behind the scenes, but Eisenhower did. I don't have that quotation in front of me, but you will look up in my book. I did tell about how he In fact, threatened, told the head of the Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department, when there was a desegregation crisis in New Orleans, he threatened to send troops in again. And so behind the scenes, he was always in favor of it. And the myth that Eisenhower didn't want to do anything but play golf is just horrendous and false. And frankly, it's the fault of my profession when it did not do its job.
One more. Now you give the president credit for, of course, Earl Warren. My recollection of history is that Earl Warren had to go to President Eisenhower 2 or 3 times to remind him of the promise that he had made that he would indeed get the very next appointment to the Supreme Court of the United States. And that it took a little time, and it was more Earl Warren refusing to take no or refusing to be denied that appointment than it was Ike enthusiastically putting him on the court. Would you say a word or two more about that, please?
Yeah, Eisenhower, well, the important thing in that story is that Eisenhower calls Earl Warren, personally calls him, it wasn't a subordinate doing it, in November of 1952 after the election, and promised him the next opening on the Supreme Court. That's an extraordinary thing. There were no openings on the Supreme Court. And why would Eisenhower do that? And the answer is, of course, Ike knew that Warren was very liberal on civil rights. He knew him well. It's a complete myth that he didn't know him. And you rather know it's still out on the internet, alleging that Ike said that appointing Warren was the worst man fool mistake he ever made in his presidency. That's false. It never happened, but it's still out there. But having said that, why did Warren go back to him? I don't have in the documents much about Warren going back to him. The question about was, should he be the Chief Justice? And when I could call Warren in November of 1952, he had not anticipated that the Chief Justice would die. And so he looked at it again to be sure he should appoint Warren Chief Justice. And he even talks to John Foster Dulles about that and all that. But you just have to look out for what Eisenhower does in the process. He's a very deliberate decision maker. He'll try everything on for size, but look where he lands. And where he landed was on Earl Warren. And he made that recess appointment, which would be very controversial today, as you know. The recess appointment, and Warren didn't get confirmed until March 1st, 1954. But look at where he landed, and I think that's the main thing. There's an entire chapter in my book on the relationship between these two men. And there was some tension in their relationship, and I think it was primarily political. Warren had run for president 3 times. But anyway, I've gone longer than I should. But great question. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Commissioner Casal?
Thanks very much for both your presentations. I've read a few biographies on Eisenhower, and there's one event that both biographies was written by Carlo Destia. Are you familiar with that one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's one where he indicates that in the drive toward the SAR, Patton wanted to desegregate the rifle brigades because he just frankly needed more shooters. But the Army was formally segregated. He went to Eisenhower to get approval. Eisenhower said, well, Schaefer can't make that determination. I've got to take it up to George Marshall. George Marshall pretty much wanted to do it, but it was taken up to the staff of FDR, who said they're not going to allow that to happen. Marshall then communicated that to Eisenhower, basically saying that you can't do it. And Eisenhower simply said to Patton, do whatever you want to do. Is that true?
I'm sorry, I'm not expert on that. As far as I know, your account is accurate, but that's not. Dawn, do you know anything on that?
I'm sorry, I'm not an expert in that particular moment either, but it's sounding familiar to me.
Yeah, I was certainly not happy with the policy, but I can't validate that story for sure. I'm sorry.
Commissioner Harris?
I should explain, I made a point in my old age, by the way, of focusing on the Eisenhower presidency, and I'm not a war expert. I'm sorry.
I just have a quick comment. First, I want to thank you both for the very interesting presentation. I am particularly interested in the ins and outs of the strategies of passing the Civil Rights Act of 1957, in part because I want to make a plug for my friend and late colleague, Carl Auerbach, who is a professor of law, or was a professor of law, at the University of San Diego up until last year when he passed away at the age of 100. Professor Auerbach was very closely involved in the negotiations for the Civil Rights Act of 1957. As a law professor at the University of Minnesota at the time, he was very knowledgeable about the differences between law and equity, between civil and criminal contempt. And as a result, he was the one who came up with the legal basis for the compromise that finally got the act through. And so I just want to mention my late colleague, because I know I speak for the faculty at the University of San Diego. We all miss him.
Oh, yeah, great man. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just end with thanks again for your presentation, for coming to join us. We're all very, very grateful to be able to be the recipient of so much information about President Eisenhower and the origin of this commission. I also thank Brian Walsh, Pam Dunstan, Michelle Yorkman-Ramey, Warren Orr, and all of our staff for their assistance in setting up today's presentations and making today's meeting run as smoothly as possible. Thank you. There's no further business. I hereby adjourn our meeting at 11:50 Eastern Daylight Time. Thank you.